There we go. Now it's green. Okay. I didn't even. Oh, did I advance them? I did. I did. I think I just want to put it in my pocket. Okay. Hello, everybody. My name is Bruce Momjian. I am one of the Postgres core team members, and I work for Enterprise DB. But this talk is not really specific about Postgres, and it's not really specific about what I do at Enterprise DB. It's really about building open source teams. So some of the things I've learned in working with Postgres are in this. Some of the things I've learned in working for Enterprise DB, I've learned. Some of the things here I've learned from attending leadership seminars and from reading sort of leadership material. It's sort of part of it's technical and part of it is the life lesson, really, in sort of being a leader, in building groups to work on common projects. A lot of this relates to my involvement with the internet, which started in, I guess, 1991 when I had internet connectivity at my house and was running Unix, and got involved with some of the Usenet groups and some of the sort of online communities way early on. I remember when I was on the internet and, I had email and I had to explain to people what email was. It's, you send this electronic message and it goes out and then it arrives places and then it comes back. And I remember just sort of having there was actually an email address book that was printed in the bookstores. I mean, that was very early on, but I've been doing this for a long time. I have learned quite a bit. And frankly, there are some things that I think work really well in building open source teams, and there's some really caustic, damaging things you can do in building open source teams. And I've learned some of those, and that's what this talk is going to be about. Okay. And what I'm going to highlight is some of the things that are unique about open source teams, some of the distance requirements, some of the electronic requirements, and then working with volunteers. There's a whole bunch of aspects here that I wanted to cover. But again, I've been working as an open source manager for 3 companies. Started with Postgres in 1996, but again, my involvement even goes before that. So what are we going to talk about? How do you build open source teams? There's 3 concepts that I think are fundamental to this, and I get asked about this a lot. I get asked about this a lot at conferences when I'm talking to people. Even last night, I was at we had the party at 9 p.m. at the restaurant, and somebody was sort of explaining, how did that work? How did you kind of do this, and how did it get started? And so there are some secrets to this. First off is motivation. Because you're building an open source team, by definition, you're not typically monetarily motivating people, and that's a challenge. And then there's some challenges, number 2, related to open source management in sort of that whole span of things. And then finally, there's development process challenges, and we're gonna kind of walk through these one at a time. Okay, so let's talk about open source motivations. Why do people get involved with open source? If you don't understand this, you're really gonna have trouble motivating anyone else, because again, it's sort of a secret sauce that is involved in getting people to get involved with open source. But at the same time, and again, there's a lot of mysteries in this. Like, for example, you look at all the software you use and you're like, well, okay, it's developed by open source and whatever. But when you think, well, you're telling me that the operating system I run and the browser I run and the word processor I run and development tools I use, they're all developed by volunteers somehow. People who are all over the world who communicate by email, they're developing this software, and it's actually a better quality than one done in the company. And does that make sense? I mean, does that sound like something that would be possible? No, it really doesn't. It really sounds like something that shouldn't work, but indeed it does, and you have to kind of dig down to some of the core roots of why that works to sort of understand, what it is that makes this thing work. Because on the surface, it sounds like it's something that wouldn't work. Okay, so when I'm talking to people, or I'm talking to non-technical people that I meet just people I meet at a party or at church or whatever, and they're like, well, what do you do? And I still think, there's only a handful of people. I've been to the same church for 20 years. I think there's a handful of people who know like what I do actually. Like, they think, well, he travels a lot and he goes to some odd countries every month and he works from home. And, I don't think a lot of them really understand I wrote a book years ago about Postgres, and they think it's all related to that book I wrote. Well, no, but that's the closest they can get, I guess. So the question is, what motivates people to work on open source? And there's really, I think, 4 fundamental things, and it's really related to the URL here. By the way, I should clarify that all this presentation is actually available right now at that URL. So there's probably 30 presentations now. The ones I did on Friday about nulls and security are on there, and again, probably 28 other ones are at that URL, including this one. So this URL here down at the bottom is an article that kind of talks about why people get involved in open source. There's also some other articles that kind of talk about it. But the Mythical Man Month actually kind of references it a little bit, but not open source, but it's sort of in a way. But there's 4 fundamental things. 1, professional advancement, learning new skills. So this would be somebody who's wants to get involved more with technology. Maybe they're not getting that kind of feedback in their current employment, and therefore they do this on weekends or when they have at nights or sometimes during lunch. The second one is a practical need for the software. They're actually working on open source not to help themselves, but because I need that feature, okay? Or I need something, I want to make sure that software keeps going and keeps growing, and that's why I'm going to pour money into it, because it's a fundamental aspect of my business, and therefore I need it to succeed. Okay, so both of them are kind of mixed together. One, I need a specific thing. One, I need the software to keep growing. The third one, mental stimulation. This is not the same as number 1. Number 1 is more, I want to grow in my professional life. I want to gain new skills that help me to be employable. Okay. Number 3, mental stimulation, is I just like a puzzle. I just like doing things that are challenging, that help me sort of invigorate my mind and help me to sort of stimulate my mental processes. That's another aspect of open source. And the fourth one, I believe in open source. I want to give back to the larger world that I'm working in. Okay. And again, open source, you would think would be an odd way to give back to the world, but if you're a technology person, odds are you're not going to be helping to build, the next homeless shelter. Like, I'm not really good with power tools. I'm probably dangerous with power tools. So if your skill is technology and you want to give to the wider world, open source might be a way of doing that. Okay. And what's really odd about these 4 things is that if you ask an individual who works in open source, which one of these motivate you, they have trouble answering, and they probably answer a couple of them. They might say, I think the mental stimulation and the professional advancement probably, and then a little bit of the 4th one. And in fact, when you're working in an open source community, it's very hard to identify which people are motivated by which things on this list. And that's another part of the mystery of the process, that people may get involved because of one of these items, and they may stay for 15 years because of another one of these items. All right. In fact, if you look at the Postgres community, most of our people have been there for like 5, 10, 15 years. These are long-term people. Part of it's because we have a very good community and a very positive community that people want to be a part of, the community that people feel my time spent with this software is useful. This is a good use of my time. If they don't think it's good use of time, they're not going to do it. Okay. That's fundamental to pretty much anyone who's a volunteer. People volunteer because they think it's a good use of their time. Which of these 4 items, I can't tell you, but it's got to be a good use of their time for them to volunteer, because they have other things to do. They have time pressures, right? So if you can build that into your project, and this is sometimes why companies that try and sort of do fake open source or open source that they control, it doesn't work because a lot of these things just don't work. A lot of them, like, certainly believe in open source. You can kind of tell pretty quickly. Practically for the software, it kind of gets controlled by the company. It's not really open for you to be involved in. Mental stimulation, to some extent. So again, you kind of have to, these all reinforce each other in a sort of magical way. If any of them are missing, or you kind of tinker with it, the plane never gets off the ground. It takes a whole bunch of things together to get a plane off the ground. And you got to have all these together, I'd say, to really be successful. So why is another sort of aspect related to the mental stimulation? Why is programming fun? And this is, again, I talked about the Mythical Man Month. This is sort of an idea that came out of that book. And I know there was a talk, I think, on Friday that did also reference the Mythical Man Month. But one of the reasons we're here on a Sunday instead of being home is because we kind of like programming. There's a sort of attraction for that to us. I can say even as a child that it was a very attractive thing to me. In fact, some ways too attractive, so I had to sort of walk away from it for a while until I was ready to sort of deal with it in a balanced way. That's a little self visibility on my part. But one of the interesting things about software versus building a statue or something that's physical in terms of hard is that programming is fun because you're making things in a medium that's tractable, in a medium that can be changed very easily with very little cost on your part. And often the problems that we deal with are very complex, and these things that we make are useful to other people. So you've kind of got this connection of things that, like, if I work on a statue of like marble, it's really expensive, and then if I make a mistake, I got to go and get another piece of marble, right? That's like hard. Software, for some reason, it's almost zero cost to modify, zero cost to distribute to people. In a lot of ways, you're more useful than a marble statue. In a lot of ways, more global than a marble statue. And again, these all kind of work together. Yes, sir. Yeah. So the point was that you're can be very Napoleonistic in commanding your computer. You have control over this thing that you're working on, and I think there is certainly an attraction to that. That you got it to do what you wanted it to do. It may take a long time to do it, but there is a sense of accomplishment there, that you've created something, and that you've mastered that particular thing. And it's not a mastery of something that would deal with sort of things you would manipulate with your hands, but for it, I'm not a mouse, but I'm not really good at that. I am really good at doing the mind part. So for me, and I think for a lot of other people in our community who have that bend where we know we're really good in that area, it's sort of an amplification for that, because instead of doing some little thing on my home computer that nobody sees, now I'm doing it on a global stage that everyone sees. In fact, one of the great things about open source is that programmers usually are sort of stuck in a little cubicle somewhere. If you think of commercial development, normally a professional, commercial software developer is in their cubicle. They go to the meetings, they come home, they go back to the office, and there's very little visibility or acknowledgement outside of that organization of what that person does. Usually the people who are visible are the managers, to some extent the sales people. And what open source does is it kind of flips it around. You don't have really managers or salespeople at all, but now the engineers are now on a global stage, and they're able to percolate up. And that's their opportunity to shine in a way that really I cannot think of any software organization where the engineers are shining. I mean, I guess Google has some. I could probably think of a couple engineers at Google who were really sharp folks. I can't think of any really in any of the financial world. I can't think of any in the retail. Again, the manager might be the visible guy, but he's not really an engineer. He might have been an engineer, but he's not an engineer anymore, right? Whereas you think of the Postgres community, or think of the open source community, the people who are visible in those communities are the engineers, are the people who are doing engineering every day. So I think open source in some ways gives engineers a new visibility and a new ability to shine that is not possible really in almost any other venue. And I think that's exciting. I think it's one of the things that motivates our people. You know, we don't Postgres community, I can't speak for the other communities really well. Postgres community does not have sort of the prima donnas or the, you know, they call me the show horse, but I think they're always joking when they say that. Yeah, I always think of I'm the horse who can count to 4 with the hoof or something, you know. But we try to I personally am always trying to promote other people. Like I got enough people know who I am. I'm always trying to bring up our other people, because those are the people who are going to grow the organization. Those are the people who are going to be impacted by having them be visible. And that's going to motivate them, and they deserve that. And they've been working hard, and they developed that super big feature. And let's make sure they get to all the conferences to talk about it. And, you know, so one of my goals is always to be pushing our folks up into that limelight and trying to stand back in the, you know, when they take the group shot, I'm trying to stay in the back because I want everyone else to be up front. I don't really care. I mean, it's not that big a deal for me, and it is a big deal for some people. So, you know, I've gotten used to it. So it doesn't, even when I was a little kid, it didn't really matter. So maybe it never mattered to me. But my point is that this is a really exciting thing. And I think the type of conference we have, and even just what we're doing here is a testament to that. Other questions? Because I want to take questions as I'm going. Okay. Yes, sir. Yeah. So the question is, what practical things do we do to promote the visibility of engineers that we have in the community? That's a great question. I'll give you a specific answer that I think is very illustrative. I go to Russia probably twice a year, 3 times a year, and Postgres historically has had a very strong group of developers in Russia. We don't have a huge user community. But we have, so I'm sorry, the question was, yeah, how do we motivate specifically people in Russia? So, I mean, how do we motivate people in our group? So, we have a lot of some really great engineers in Russia, but we don't have a huge user community in Russia. At least we didn't until very recently. So I had these engineers in Russia who were doing some amazing work. You can say the whole world's the same, but it's not really. You know, the Russian things do things that the Europeans wouldn't think of, and the U.S. people do things. The Japanese do things that I mean, I'm Armenian, and we do things nobody else does. I mean, you know, in things differently. So, of course, everyone's different, and there's a whole spectrum of things. But for some reason, because Russia has a large history of education, and really, I'd say the idea of the puzzle kind of creativity is very big in that country, in a similar way to sort of the user interface stuff is big in Italy and France. You know, they're really good in that, right? And the Japanese are unbelievable in like detail stuff that, you know, we're not good at. So we've had some guys there, and I've always tried to get work for them. So I think there was one case where they wanted funding, and I got my company fund them for a while, and then we had a new engineer in Russia who was doing some amazing things that nobody else in the world could do. they were doing these amazing indexing things. So here's a guy who was starting Google Summer Code, and he wrote this amazing indexing capability in Postgres. This a couple years ago, and I was like, okay, so let's make sure he gets invited to the conferences. It's fully paid. He's flying now to Madrid or Prague, and he's now talking to all these people and giving a talk. I remember one time he came into Dublin. He flew into Dublin. We had a big Postgres European conference there. He was talking about the JSON stuff we did in Postgres 9.4 and some of the indexing stuff that he had developed, and he was comparing Postgres to JSON, and he puts a graph up on the slide, and everyone starts clapping. I've never seen a graph be put up on a slide and have an audience just spontaneously go into applause. I mean, there was that much excitement that this guy, what he had done, and in fact, it's changed the way Postgres is adopted in the past year because he has done this amazing thing with this particular type of index on JSON. So my point is that here you've got somebody who's at the Moscow Nuclear Atomic University. I think that's the name. I've spoken there. I went. He emailed me and he said, my university would like me to come to speak. And I'm like, great, just tell me when to come. Like, I'm gonna be there. And I went and I spoke for a full day to all their classes. So here you have a guy, he's in a university in Moscow. He's probably 22, 23. He's finished his doctorate. But instead of being sort of shoved into a little company to work on some website or some troubleshooting or new software that does email, whatever, text spam, I don't know, whatever. Now he's, his name's Alexander Kuratov. He goes to every European conference. He's going to be with me in Ottawa, I think, when we go next week. Everyone knows his name in the Postgres community. He started a company with some of the other Russian guys now, and they've got VC funding over there. He's getting married to a girl from she's from Belarus, from Minsk, Belarus. So I got to know her. I'm going to St. Petersburg next month, and we're going to do stuff together, and my wife's coming too. And so what's really interesting is you have somebody who has incredible capability, but instead of sort of being limited by his geographic area or whatever university he went to, he's now operating on a global stage in a really, to an extent that's really almost impossible in normal commercial software development, because everyone knows his name. He has employment opportunities. He's starting his own company with the venture funding with some other Russian guys. He's speaking at conferences. His fiance is like, wow, this guy must be amazing. He's, I got, and even something like, I was in Madrid and he introduces his girlfriend to me, and I'm talking to her for 20 minutes and asking her about Minsk, and maybe you can come to Minsk someday, and we can, there's some companies that want you to talk, and we go and we sit in Madrid, and Alexander is speaking, and I'm sitting next to the girlfriend, and I can see she has coached him in how, and we both want him to succeed in this talk. And if he says something a little confusing, I'm sort of saying, do you mean this other thing? And he's like, yeah, that's what I mean. So I'm trying to help the audience kind of stay with what he's saying, because he's so brilliant that sometimes you can't understand what he's saying as a normal person. And at the end, she and like, wow, he did a great job. It was a great talk, and everyone understood. And so I think that's an example of how you try and bring those people up. And again, people see that, and they see that if you work hard and you do some creative thing that nobody else can do or adds to the community, that there are pluses to that. And when you're working as a volunteer for years to get to that point, it's very hard to justify all that expenditure of time, but it does, in a lot of sense, pay off. And even in my case, I worked for 3 years as a volunteer before I became fully employed, and I hid how much time I spent for my wife for quite a while, and then she sort of figured it out, and then she said, well, why are you spending time in the basement working on this volunteer thing instead of spending more time with the family? Well, there's no answer to that question. But then as your career went up and as you now became, now they wanted me to be an author. I wrote a book about Postgres. Like, oh, my husband's an author. Maybe this thing's okay. And now you have a job and you're like, oh, now he has a job and he's working from home now and he's flying around and we're getting more money. So it must be good. So it's kind of a delayed, I'd say open source in some ways is a delayed gratification because you do this thing as a volunteer and there's no guarantee of anything. Whereas normally if you're an employee, you get the job, here's the salary, you show up, and it's very predictable. But fortunately, if you look at some of the stuff we've done, Peter Gagan, a guy from Dublin who now works in San Francisco, he worked on the big feature for 9.5, Upsert. And again, he's going to be the big guy for this year, and he's going to be talking about it, and everyone knows his name, and his name appears at the top of the release notes. And so there is sort of this meritocracy, and when people do a good job, you make sure that they get noticed. Other questions? Okay. So let's talk about having talked about all the wonderful things of why people want to do open source. Let's talk about some of the challenges. And I'm not going to minimize these challenges. I'm going to try and give you some solutions on how to do them, but they exist, and they exist in a big way. And sometimes they're overwhelming to people who start with open source. I've kind of gotten used to it, and I'm kind of good at it. But again, they are challenges. You can't deny them. Communication, that's probably your biggest one. How are you going to communicate to these people? Because in a traditional business, everyone comes into the office and there's no real communication challenges there. I mean, there's going to be some jerks you can't talk to, but in general, there's no challenges of how am I going to actually talk to or communicate with my team. I call them all in a room and I talk to them, right? I can look at their body language. I can know who's had a bad day. I know who's not feeling well. I know who's not doing the job. I can watch them. I mean, there's a whole bunch of stuff that I get because I'm in a commercial environment. They're forced to show up and we can all fit together. We don't have any of that in the community, right? So we've got to communicate by email. We've got to communicate sometimes by telephone. I used to do a lot of that. I think I told you that last night, that I call people and I just say, hey, how's it going? Or I get them on Skype and how you doing? How are you feeling about the release? How do you think this particular issue went? And you're now showing concern for the person. Instant messaging we use a lot. Group chat, we have an IRC channel that kind of helps us. We have a wiki for sort of stable information that doesn't change a lot. We have a software configuration manager, or what like we use Git, so that kind of thing, SCM. And we have conferences, which is sort of our only time when we can all be together. So we have a big conference in Ottawa. I'm flying tomorrow from here to Ottawa, and I'll spend a week there. It's our big sort of developer conference for the year, is always up in Ottawa. But I got a conference in St. Petersburg next month, and then another one in Texas, and Vienna, and San Francisco, and all the way out through the rest of the year. And so those conferences allow us to kind of get together and sort of get to see each other in one room. Travel distance is a challenge. It's very expensive. It's very time consuming. You only often you only have a few people in one location. I actually talked to you about this last night, that the idea of traveling, what you would think would be a complete waste of time. Like, if I could send an email, I could send out to thousands of people. Why would I travel? Why would I come to a conference like this? It's because for some reason, when you're taking time to come to somebody's city and spend time with them and, tell jokes and eat lunch and go walking, down to the store and then get lost and then go up the one-way road and all the other crazy things that you do. Hey, Peter's here. So all the crazy things that you do, that helps to build bonds. That helps to help for people to understand who you are, understand why what they're doing is important, helps to sort of show that what you're doing is valuable. And that translates into people actually saying, yeah, I think I really do want to spend time on this, in a way that you don't get when you just send an email. It's sort of like, somebody showing up at your door or getting a phone call versus getting like a postcard. Postcard, you know, but if somebody shows up and they've got a pie with them and we're going to sit and have tea and let's talk about the baseball game or whatever, even if they just showed up and they didn't do anything related to work, you know, have it like if your boss comes to your house and like he's got like root beer and a pizza and we have a good time, we sit around by the pool and he leaves, he doesn't talk about work at all, right? When I come in Monday morning, the boss doesn't look the same as the one I left on Friday, right? And there's a magic to that that you know, I think is very important. In fact, you know, when I'm looking for leadership and I'm trying to understand what is it about leadership that's key, there's I don't know how to explain this. There's an unspoken importance to human relationships that you can't extrapolate out of ordinary life. You know, if everything was just like a balance sheet and you got $100 and you just, okay, I went to work and I made that amount and I'll get this paycheck and then, but that's not the way the world doesn't work that way. That's not what makes people happy. That's not what motivates people. That's not what is important to people. And you know, in fact, if you look at you know, at leaders, you have to model a specific leader. You can model like Steve Jobs. Maybe you think he was a great leader. You can model like the guy who had a Westinghouse. You can think he was a great leader. You can look at some of the other people and you can say, well, was a great. Well, you know, when I'm looking to see a great leader, you know, as a Christian, I'm often looking as well, how did Jesus handle this? Like, how did he do things? And when you look at that, it opens in a completely new vista of understanding, because he came here to be with us in a way that he didn't have to do. So when I think I'm going to these places, I'm going because that's what he would have done. You know, he didn't sort of sit up in the synagogue somewhere and just like shout at everybody, right? He had parties. He went to places. The first miracle was water into wine at a wedding, okay? And I have to understand that. Even if I don't agree with it, I have to say, that's what I have to do, you know? And if you look at some of the leadership, John Maxwell is a great guy. Some of the leadership guys actually sort of key into that, and they understand that there's a certain dynamic and a certain mystery to leadership that really doesn't translate a lot of times into logic, but it doesn't, just because it isn't logical doesn't mean it's not important. So I know that's a long answer. I guess it fits for a Sunday morning, but it is a challenge. It is a challenge. Time zones, this is crazy. Like, I had to call somebody in Russia to get an answer on some crisis we had, and I know the guy really well, so like I call his cell phone and it's 12:30 at night, and he picks up his cell phone in bed and he goes to his Skype, and I ask him 10 minutes of questions about something that happened in Moscow that day. And I'm like, I'm sorry I woke you up, buddy. You know, I had to have the answer and I appreciate it. And he goes back to bed. So you've got people in all sorts of time zones. A lot of times cell phone stuff is good because people aren't in the office. The 9 to 5 thing doesn't work really well. When I was working on projects once, I had a case where I was working on the Windows port of Postgres, and I had a guy in Sweden and I had a guy in Australia. So it was me, who was more the manager. I had the guy in Sweden, I had a guy in Australia. So I would wake up in the morning and I would talk to the guy in Sweden because my morning was his evening, and because he was doing it in off hours, he could really only work on it in the evening. So then I'd work during the day, and then like 10 o'clock at night, the guy in Australia would wake up, and he worked in the morning. So I had these crazy days where I would have to get up early to work with the guy in Sweden, go through the whole day, and then like from 10 o'clock till like 1 a.m., I'd work with the Australian guy to address all the things the Sweden guy mentioned in the morning. And that would just happen for months because that's just what I had. I had guys all over with time zones, and I had to be available. Almost all of it was on chat because that's the way they wanted to work. But we got the job done. They were great guys, Magnus Hagender and Claudio Natoli in Australia. it's kind of weird, but you adjust. And working from home helps because you're not locked into 9 to 5 either, right? Culture, you have to really be um, you have to be mindful of this. I worked for a Japanese company for 5 years, so again, I had a different style. The Russians are different in the way they do things. The Germans are different in the way they do things. Latin Americans are different in the way they do things. Chinese are different. Indians are different. Pakistanis are different than Indians. You really sort of have to be sensitive to that, but at the same time, you're dealing with a global group, so you can't just shift your whole culture to match one of them. And they understand that, and usually it works really well. But you want to be sort of culturally sensitive in certain areas. The Russian case, for particularly, I did it in a way to, Russia's had so much difficulty in the past couple of years with the sanctions and everything, and so we're sensitive to that, and we're trying not to add to it. Language, I hate to say, almost everything we do is in English. I don't speak anything but English. I'm very good at speaking very simple English when I go to foreign countries, but language is an issue. English is almost a requirement. The email list, we do have some language specific chat channels and email lists, but in general, a lot of this stuff is in English, and it is a challenge. I really wish I could do more in that area. Funding, well, this is a great, well, you don't have any money, so you have to work around it. Usually people will have take money out of their own pocket to attend a certain level of conference. Fortunately, most of the development they have pretty much inexpensive internet connections, so that part really doesn't a problem. We do allow funding. We have conferences who fund people, so the Ottawa Conference funds is like maybe 10 or 15 people every year, fly them in, give them hotels, and part of the money we spend as sponsor, as a company, and part of the money is for admission, is basically to fund those developers to come in, because the conference wouldn't be the same without them. Like, the conference would not be the same if the Russians weren't there. The conference would not be the same if the Japanese weren't there. Conference would not be the same if some of the Eastern Europeans weren't there. And again, some of these people have big challenges. And once they go a couple times, they get visibility, they get job offers. Then maybe a couple of years down the line, they don't need funding anymore, because now their company's going to fund them, because they're now, they now have income coming from Postgres. So a lot of that is bootstrapping. Finally, development process. This is, again, a mysterious kind of area that doesn't sort of fit the typical Western way of thinking of work. But I think if you think holistically about it, then I think it does fit. So some of this will resonate with you in a way that monetarily it wouldn't. So the first thing is to involve everyone. Obviously, the more hierarchical your organization is, the less people feel they're part of it. So if somebody's joining organization, they're saying, well, I'm like just a private, and I've got people over me, and I've got generals over me, and my sergeant's always yelling at me, and right, does that person really feel part of the team? Not really. They certainly don't think they're going to become a general one day. They're just like down there, right? And they just want to get through it. Now, I understand the military maybe has to be structured that way. Open source does not. So the more the less hierarchical you are, the more people feel, I am part of that team. I can make a difference. I can get involved. My work matters. And the more you can inject that into your organization, the more you're going to get involvement of people. The more hierarchical, obviously, the worse. Find each person's motivator. Why are they involved? What makes them give their time to the community? We talked about this earlier about motivating volunteers. But there's certain things that really motivate. It might be that person wants acknowledgement publicly. That might be their motivator. Their motivator might be fixing problems, a fixer, somebody who likes to fix things. That might not be the same as the person who's motivated by public recognition. It could be that they actually just want to get this feature into the software. They don't care about any other things, right? And the more you understand that other person's motivation, the more you can make sure that they receive what they're looking for, right? If you don't know, then you're not really going to be able. If you give somebody if somebody who's looking for public recognition, you just keep giving them hard problems, they're not, you're not really you're not really speaking to them. Okay. I mean, there's a very well-known Christian book. It's called, what's somebody's love language? Is it, do they want praise? Do they want, acts of service? Do they want gifts? And again, you have to look, and don't assume that your love language is the same as the other person. You look at that other person, and they're going to have something completely different that motivates them. And you have to be objective enough to understand that. I know that my wife's love languages are different than my love languages. And if you understand that, then you're going to, even if you say it doesn't mean anything to me, that you tell me words of praise mean nothing to me, right? But it may mean a lot to that other person, right? And then you need to understand that. Reach out to individuals. I talked about this before. The idea of actually spending one-on-one time with people. I know in our organization, almost all the managers are required to have one-on-one meetings with all their reportees every week. And I know it's a huge burden. I'm not a manager, so I can't even speak to it. But I know that they have scheduled one-on-one time with a lot of their reportees, because it's important that you have that, and particularly in an organization that's distributed, right? If everyone's in the same building, well, you go to lunch with them one day, you go to lunch with another day, it doesn't matter. You see them the hallway, you go to meetings with them. That's not true. So a lot of times you want to take that one-on-one time, and that means a lot to people. It really does. Harvest the strength of the team. Know who your teammates are. If you're fielding a baseball team, you know who the best pitcher is. You know who the best first baseman is. You know who the best shortstop is. Find out who your good people are. When you have a problem, know who those people are. Go to those people. Okay. So a lot of times you'll go to a person, say, Alvaro, I know you're really busy, but I got this. We have this problem. I know you're really good at this. I really need you to look at it for me. And they're like, okay. You didn't give them anything. You didn't pay them. You didn't. But you basically said, you are the guy for this thing. I know that. I know it's going to be hard. I will help you as much as I can, but I really need you to look at this, and I really need this change made. And it gets done. And that person will go that extra mile, partially because you've already built the relationship with that person, and you've already spent time, and you've already showed that person that person's valuable to you, and you've already shown that you've already understood that person's love language, and you understand how to communicate to that person in a way that that person values. And I'm really not saying this in a way to manipulate people. I'm really trying to say, don't treat everyone the same. Understand who they are as individuals and speak to them as individuals. Okay. And, honestly, love them as individuals, because that's what you want to happen as when you're on a team. Okay. You don't want them not to care about you. And that's the worst feeling in the world. So you don't want that. Number 5, that's hilarious. There's always someone smarter than you. This is incredibly, does that resonate to anybody here? Okay. That is incredibly humiliating. At least to me, it was, where you work on a patch and you spend, I don't know, a week or 4 days working on a patch, and you're like, oh, it's going to have this feature. It's going to be super wonderful. And you're like, okay, I tested it and I went through all the code, and here the world is my patch. And you send it out, and thousands of people all of a sudden can see your patch. And somebody in the Czech Republic goes, why did you do that right there? That's wrong. You need to do this other thing. And you're like, oh yeah, that's right. And you're like, oh, because what they've done is they've exposed a flaw in your mental ability, right? And then somebody from Brazil goes, well, I don't know about that thing, but this other thing is, we've got it, that we can't, that's got to be done differently. And then there's a third guy from Canada who, has some other thing. And you might go through 7 iterations of this patch by the time you get it done. And you're like, you feel about this tall, because everybody now knows that you can't spell things, and you obviously can't see obvious bugs that appear to everybody else, it seems. But the thing that you have to remember is that the guy in Brazil and the Czech Republic and Canada, those are different people. The guy in Canada didn't see the bug the Czech Republic guy saw, and he didn't see the thing the Brazil guy saw. So the point is that you want to harness the ability of all your people. So just because you didn't see the things doesn't mean those other people could have written that patch. They probably couldn't have, but they were good enough to see your mistake. Okay. So the beauty of this system, if it's done right, and this is really I think the crux of why open source is so powerful, is that you're now amplifying your ability by taking the best ideas from thousands and thousands of people and putting it into every single patch. And this does not happen effectively in organizations, in companies, in closed source development, because again, there's usually very little motivation for people to look at what other people are doing. There's very little, it's a very small organization. You're just looking at whoever the company happened to hire on a particular day. And they're not really looking for improving things. They're not really looking for, they have employees have other things to worry about. They're not really looking, unless a very exceptional closed source organization that would have the kind of ability to critique and amplify the ability of all the employees. And I'm sure there are organizations out there, but that's not the tip. That's definitely not the typical. And even if they have 10 engineers, 15 engineers, 20, 25 engineers. They don't have thousands of engineers. Okay. And again, that ability to get the best out of everybody, to have me create it and have people from all over the world be able to improve it incrementally, that's why open source is so powerful. That's why the quality is so good and the technology is so good, and why we're here, even though open source has no money and a lot of other limitations. And then finally, produce work people can be proud of. People don't want to be on a losing team. People don't want to be on a team where we can't do anything right. Okay, they want to be on a team where I'm proud of what we produce. I'm proud of what we put out. And again, that's part of it. That doesn't mean we sugarcoat everything. When we mess up, I am very, very loud in telling people we've messed up, and I'm embarrassed. Okay, but again, that they're just for a motivator, so we understand that we've failed here, and we need to step up. Another requirement, of course, because you have volunteers, is you've got to have clean code. If you hire somebody to work on code, they're going to work on it. Doesn't matter how messy it is. Okay. If you're hired to work on a piece of code, then you're going to make the best of it. It might be horrendous. It might have no comments. It might be completely unintelligible, but you're hired to do it. So you will figure out a way. You cannot do that with open source. People are not being paid to look at your ugly code. So code clarity is actually very, very important in that environment, because people have got to be able to understand it easily. You're not paying them to do it. And you also have to have good quality documentation, because again, that rolls back to producing work you can be proud of. Okay. And finally, this is sort of a summary. Lead by example, not from authority. Again, I talked about the idea of having a very non-hierarchical organization, so people feel that they're part of that organization. They feel like that I am helping, I am really part of this team, and my contribution counts. Okay, that's really important. Like if you think of the military, they're not really trying to help people think of a part of the team, because they control all their soldiers. You know, when a sergeant says you have to go over there, the guy's got to do it. You don't really need him to be motivated. He's got to do it. Like you're not trying to motivate him as a volunteer to go peel the potatoes. Like he's going to do whatever you tell him to do. Okay. So they don't have to have a meritocracy type of environment, but in an open source team, you have to, because these people are volunteers. You can't force them to do anything. So you're always trying to lead from example. You're trying to be what we call a servant leader, somebody who's there to serve, not somebody who's there to sort of dictate or, browbeat people or anything. That's just not going to work. See the value of other people's opinions. Just because you don't agree with somebody doesn't mean it's not a valid opinion. And a lot of times in our discussions, what happens if I have opinion on something, somebody has a disagreement, we'll have a long conversation. the right opinion might be somewhere in the middle of the two opinions. It might not be my opinion, and it might not be his opinion, but it might be somewhere in the middle. So the idea of valuing other people's opinions, just as you'd value their code contributions. When somebody says that variable is poorly named, I'm like, I really want to say no. I really want to say no. I like my name. But if I have to admit that he might be right, because I'm going to be biased on my own naming. And if it makes him feel like he's contributed by renaming it and it's slightly better, let's rename it. It's a patch. It's a name of variable. Nobody's going to see it, right? If it's worse, don't do it. But if it's marginally better, and you're going to have to eat crow to do it, eat the crow and make the change, right? Because you're enabling that community process. You're enabling that person to be part of that patch. Accept failure gracefully. That's, again, exactly what I'm saying. That when people do things, when you fail, when something you've tried didn't work, when you apply a patch that broke everything, you have to kind of eat that humble pie. You're working in a, it's sort of like you're working in a global environment. Like you took your skull off and like everyone's staring at your brain. Like that's kind of the environment you're in, right? And you're working in a global stage. So there's going to be failures, there's going to be embarrassments, there's going to be, and you just have to say, I'm working in a global stage. If I was in a little cubicle and I was writing code, I wouldn't have that problem. But I wouldn't have any of the advantages either. And I have to suck it up. Seek consensus. Again, that community, by seeking consensus, you're magnifying all those abilities, all those sort of brains to work together to come to a good solution. And then don't be ruled by deadlines, because that consensus sometimes takes longer than it would within a company. Within a company, you can basically say, we are going to decide at this meeting X. I cannot do that. None of our community guys can do that. What we can do is to set an expectation, set sort of a goal, and lead by example, but we have to wait. We have to wait for that process to run because we really don't have control over it. That's part of the process of having volunteers. That's part of the process of helping everyone feel empowered, that we don't have the ability to do that. That's all I kind of wanted to go over. Again, a lot of stuff really to sort of for you to digest. I'd like to take a couple minutes of questions. I think we have 3 minutes or something like that to grab some questions. We got 6 minutes. Great questions. Great. Yes, sir. So the question is, somebody sees some code, they develop a patch, and then it seems like it takes a long time for anything to happen. Okay. So that's a challenge for open source communities, I guess. If you think of it in the corporate world, everything pretty much comes from the top down. So everything comes from marketing or sales, and then to some extent testing is going to drive what things you work on in the corporate environment. Obviously in the community environment, somebody's going to want to add something to the software, and how does that process happen? We try and effectively document how to do that. If there is a to-do list, and we try and document like the steps you should go through before writing the patch. Actually, we tell people, send an email and get approval, get acceptance of the idea of the feature, or the idea of the change, so that you're not writing something and then we're saying, oh, we don't want it. Let's talk about it first. So we try and inculcate that type of process so that they're getting feedback early on whether this is a fruitful direction to go in. So knowing typically what we're going to ask them to do is we're going to say, first, get approval for the idea, then get approval for the implementation. How we now agree we want to do it, how you want to do it, what does he want the syntax to be, what modules you're going to modify, how is it going to operate, what's the user interface going to be. And then once you've got that approved, that kind of agreed on in the community, then you actually write the patch shows up, we tell you to put it in a commit fest, and then eventually we'll review it and probably apply it. So what we do have trouble with is people who just sort of like, they don't understand this whole community thing exists. They haven't seen how to get involved. They haven't read the to-do list. They haven't looked at the developer's FAQ at all. So they're just kind of showing up. They say, I'm going to write a patch. They haven't gone through any of that. And that can be a very jarring experience, because again, when our process, we have to now take the patch and we have to walk you back 2 steps and say, okay, tell me why we want this. Okay, now let's talk about the implementation. And you've already got the patch done, right? And you're feeling very bad. So it's a process problem that is a community. It's hard for us to understand. Now, if it's a bug fix, that's pretty easy because we know we want the bug fix, right? But in terms of features, it usually needs to walk that process. And so a lot of times we have to take people back a little bit and walk them through the email of the discussion of getting them to that patch. So they're probably going to modify the patch a couple times and then get applied. What we don't want to do is have somebody report a bug or send a patch and like they don't get any reply. That's like the worst. So one of my jobs is to look at that email thread every so often and look maybe a month back and say, oh, what did we do with this? Nobody's replied to it. Like what? Like, why are we not, let's get some discussion on this. So I try and go back and make sure that people do get that kind of feedback. But it's a process problem, definitely, because you have unknown actors sort of showing up at unusual parts in the process and wondering why that showing up isn't working. And that's, a challenge. Yes, sir. Yeah. So the question is, how do you deal with members who are contributing to the community, but also through their behavior alienating them? A lot of times that's going to be something that the core team, there's a group of 6 core team members, and the core team is typically going to be involved there. So in that environment, typically somebody in the core team has some sort of personal relationship with that individual. Okay, because obviously doing that on the list is never going to work. Trying to correct it on the list is never going to work. A lot of times it's me, but again, we have 6 of us, so a lot of times it's often it's someone else. But you'll basically, the point is that you want to be in an environment where you've already built relationships with those individuals. So you're not showing up as the bad guy, right? You've already got a relationship with that person. You already know that person. You understand why they're motivated. You understand what they're doing. You're thankful. You're grateful for what they've done. So you've already got a rapport with them. And then you need to have that hard talk. And you need to say, listen, John, we have an issue here. I think it's hurting other individuals. And you don't say a lot. You actually try and get the other person to talk. And to a certain extent, they're going to understand that. They're kind of going to know, because the type of things that they're doing in the community are things that they probably, and you don't know this, but these are probably things they've historically had personality difficulties with in the past. So when you're mentioning this, it's not like, oh, what do you mean I have 3 legs? I mean, they already have a framework to understand this. And because you're talking in a way that also shows care for them, like you're not just sort of unloading on them, and trying not to say too much, or and letting them talk. Usually they're going to walk through and they say, yeah, I think I can do better, than I'm doing. And you're like, oh, well, I appreciate you working on this. Thank you very much. And then that's it. And then nothing may come of it. And you may have to come back in 3 months and say, I think we still have an issue here, and then, you may need to come back 3 months later, and say we're still, and then, if you need to, then you need to ratchet up the ramifications of what they're doing if they're really not kind of coming along. But fortunately, we've had that in a very rare cases, and I'm very proud of that. I know many open source communities are not that way. So I think I've run out of time, and I want to thank everybody for attending, and I think it's lunchtime.
Your customers rely on your website or application. If it's slow or non-responsive, it infuriates your users and costs you money. Keeping your business-critical systems humming along requires insight into what they're doing. Your system metrics tell stories that can reveal performance bottlenecks, resource limitations, and other problems. But how do you keep an eye on all of your system's performance metrics in real time and record this data for later analysis? Enter Longview, the new way to see what's really going on under the hood. The Longview dashboard lets you visualize the status of all your systems, providing you with a bird's eye view of your entire fleet. You can sort by CPU, memory, swap, processes load, and network usage. Click a specific system to access its individual dashboard, then click and drag to zoom in on choke points and get more detail. Comprehensive network data, including inbound and outbound traffic, is available on the Network tab and Disk Writes and Frisks tab, while the Process Explorer displays usage statistics for individual processes. The System Info tab shows listening services, active connections, and available updates. Adding Longview to a system is easy. Just click the button, copy the one-line installation command, then run the command on your Linux system to complete the process. The agent will begin collecting data and sending it to Longview. Then the graphs start rolling. Use Longview to gain visibility into your servers, so when your website or app heats up, it stays up.
Citrix Zen Server gives you everything you need to integrate, manage, and automate a virtual data center, all on an enterprise-class, cloud-proven virtual platform, and at a third of the cost of other solutions. But why even bother with virtualizing your server infrastructure in the first place? Well, let's say you have a traditional one server to one application architecture, but you're running out of resources and performance is suffering. Once you order new server hardware, you'll wait for delivery, configure it, install your business application, stage and test the server, and finally, add it to your production farm. If you've been through this process before, you know it can take weeks or even months. You also know it's a manually intensive process that will burden your team every time you outgrow your current setup. With a virtual server solution, you could accomplish all of that in less than half a day. Server virtualization software separates the OS and application from the underlying server hardware. And with multiple virtual machines on a single server, you can use each of them to run different OSs and applications. This makes it possible to move your virtual machines from one piece of hardware to another whenever you want, to maximize utilization, simplify maintenance, or recover from a hardware failure, and without slowing down your applications or users. Clearly, server virtualization provides big benefits, and Citrix Zen Server provides even more. Since it's built on an open platform, Zen Server plays well with your existing hardware, storage systems, and IT management software, as well as with the industry's leading cloud service providers. Best of all, you can get started by downloading a fully functional, production-ready version of Zen Server for free. After a 10-minute installation process, you'll see how easy it is to start virtualizing your workloads and automating your IT management processes. And when you're ready for a richer set of management tools, just upgrade to one of the premium editions of Zen Server. So whether you're interested in virtualizing servers for the first time, expanding your server virtualization footprint, or moving server workloads to the cloud, download and install Zen Server today and see how it can help you simplify your IT environment. Citrix Zen Server. Do more. Don't spend more.